I just have two more questions for you for now, Professor Saxby. As your research continues, I'd love to have you back, but I can't talk to a working scientist right now without asking how the sort of the recent retraction of the administration's support for science is having an impact on you, your lab, your colleagues.
Yeah, I mean, it's shocking and devastating. And there has always been bipartisan support in this country for research. I think there's been a recognition that having strong science is great for our economy. It's an investment in human capital. And yet we've had these attacks on scientists. And I've had a couple of my students whose funding has been suddenly pulled, in the middle of their training, funds that they had budgeted around. It feels like a hostile, like if a hostile foreign power were to try to destabilize this country, it doesn't feel that different from what's happening right now inside universities.
Wow. Do you find that you or your colleagues are like having to do even things like comb through grant applications just to remove triggering keywords for the administration?
Yeah, I mean, I was actually the person that released that word list that you might have seen circulating around on social media. That was something that came from a colleague of mine who got it from his program officer at the National Science Foundation. It was the list of terms that included things like women and socioeconomic. Essentially, any kind of work you're going to do on humans is rendered ineligible by these kinds of terms. It feels like we're living in, Soviet Russia or Maoist China. And this is not how we build a free society.
I don't even know what to say.
Me neither.
That is genuinely shocking. Like, don't put the word woman in your grant application. Oh my God. Okay. Not that, 50% of humanity doesn't deserve more research done on their experience.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me just switch gears once again, because the last question I do have for you for now, for Professor, is what does your husband think about all of this, about your research?
Oh my gosh, that's the $1 million question. Thankfully, I married a great dad with a great sense of humor. And he's been he's read every chapter of the dad book, including the chapters that that talk about him and tell stories about his parenting, and has been a big supporter. He thinks it's funny that so much of my work is about motivating men to care and step up more around the household, because he's actually terrific at that, and I'm the slacker. I'm the one who's like always distracted staring at my laptop while he's doing the dishes and taking the kids places. So he generally puts me to shame, but
clone that guy.
I know. He's I'd like to take credit, but I think he's just a genuinely good guy.
Well, Darby Saxby is a professor of psychology at the University of Southern California, and she's at work on a book called Dad Brain, The New Science of Fatherhood. Professor Saxby, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was such a pleasure.
I'm Meghna Chakrabarty. This is On Point.
On Point is a production of WBUR Boston and is distributed by APM, American Public Media.
Support for On Point comes from BetterHelp, committed to supporting mental health through therapy. Clients are matched with one of 30,000 therapists and can communicate via video, chat, or phone at betterhelp.com/public. And the Boston Symphony Orchestra, featuring the Boston Pops, celebrating America's birthday with their 4th of July fireworks spectacular, headlined by Leanne Rimes, and partnering with MeetBoston.com. Their season schedule is at bostonpops.org.
This is KUOW-FM Seattle, KUOW Tumwater, and KQOW Bellingham. We're just a few minutes away from KUOW's Week in Review. Here to give you a preview of the hour ahead is Week in Review host Bill Radke.
Hey there. Your child, your baby might be a U.S. citizen if they're born in Pullman, Washington, but if they're born in Coeur d'Alene, then maybe not. We'll discuss this morning's U.S. Supreme Court ruling. Also, this week's New York City mayoral primary. Will it embolden Seattle socialists and other progressives? Plus, the U.S. Justice Department says Washington state's mandatory child abuse reporting law is unconstitutional and anti-Catholic. We'll discuss that. Will Seattle's coming digital kiosks be helpful, cluttery, commercially? And what made us smile this week? Stay tuned.
Support for KUOW comes from Seattle Theater Group, presenting Disney's The Lion King, directed by Julie Taymor. The Serengeti comes to life in this musical, following a young lion's journey to become king. Playing the Paramount Theater December 4th through January 4th. Ticket info at stgpresents.org.
KUOW provides news and stories that matter to you. You can support KUOW in a way that works best for you. Consider making a gift from your IRA, donating a vehicle, or leaving a legacy by including KUOW in your will or trust. There are many ways to help ensure KUOW stays strong and continues serving the community with reliable journalism. Your support makes a difference in keeping KUOW thriving. Learn more about the different ways to give at kuow.org/support. And from all of us, thank you.
Seattle summer is right around the corner, and with the new and improved KUOW app, it's never been easier to listen local on the go, on a road trip, a favorite hike, with headphones, of course, or headed to a happy hour. You can listen live or catch up on your favorite local podcasts anytime and anywhere. Download the KUOW app now for iOS or Android.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Louise Schiavone. President Trump said today that he'd like to see Congress wrap up his massive tax and spending package by the 4th of July, but he's willing to give lawmakers some extra time. Meanwhile, the Republican-led Senate is racing to get the bill to the floor this weekend. NPR's Claudia Grisales reports.
Republicans are struggling to keep their conference together on the bill carrying the bulk of President Trump's domestic agenda. They're using a special legislative tool to bring the plan to the Senate floor with just a simple majority, bypassing a Democratic filibuster. But a parliamentarian review knocked out several key bill provisions, and that's forced Senate Republicans to work through the weekend to sort their differences. Senate Majority Leader John Thune can only afford to lose 3 Republican votes in the tightly controlled chamber. A source granted anonymity to discuss closed-door negotiations told NPR Thune has said he does not yet have the 50 votes needed for passage. Claudia Grisales, NPR News.
President Trump this afternoon declared on social media that he is terminating all trade discussions with Canada. At issue is a dispute over Canada's plan to put a digital services tax on American tech companies. The Supreme Court ruled today that lower courts had gone too far in efforts to block executive orders from President Trump, with federal agency bans related to birthright citizenship being a case in point. As NPR's Tamara Keith tells us, the president sees this as a victory.
He now believes that he can move forward with numerous policies. I will also note that although it was indirect, he made it seem much more direct, that he believes this was also a win for his effort to constrain birthright citizenship. And in an earlier social media post, he called it a hoax, the birthright citizenship hoax.
NPR's Tamara Keith reporting the number of murders is falling dramatically nationwide. NPR's Meg Anderson explains.
Murders fell at least 14% across the country in 2024. Crime analysts think the drop will be even bigger this year, and they say they've zeroed in on an explanation: the pandemic. John Roman, a researcher with NORC at the University of Chicago, says many young people lost a vital support system during that time: local government services.
They're the biggest employer of teachers. They employ coaches and counselors and aides and all the people that young people connect with.
In the spring of 2020, the country's local public workforce shrank by nearly 10%. 5 years later, local government employment is finally back at pre-pandemic levels. Roman says that means many services are coming back. Meg Anderson, NPR News.
Wall Street, the Dow now off 3 points. This is NPR.
This is KUOW News. I'm Paige Browning with our top stories. Washington Attorney General Nick Brown says this morning's Supreme Court ruling that limits legal challenges to President Trump's executive order on birthright citizenship is disappointing. Washington was one of several states that sued to block the order. They argued that denying citizenship to certain children would create chaos for state governments. Attorney General Brown and 4 other state attorneys general are speaking about the ruling today. Keep up with KUOW and KUOW.org for more on this story. Pike Place Market is extending its temporary ban on most car traffic through the Seattle landmark. The pilot program that started in April was supposed to wrap up in July, but now the head of the Pike Place Market Preservation and Development Authority says they want to see how the ban will affect businesses over an entire year while they come up with a street management plan. More than 900 spring Chinook salmon returned to the Walla Walla River this year. That's more than 10 times the number in 2023. That's the result of a lot of work by the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation in collaboration with the Bonneville Power Administration and the state governments of Washington and Oregon. Jeremiah Bonifer manages fisheries programs for the tribes.
Our cultural resources and our natural resources are one and the same for the tribe. And so having the ability to come out and reconnect with the landscape in an area where we've had a relationship for thousands of years is really important to all of us in the tribal community.
Bonifer hopes there will be enough salmon in future years to open up a harvest for both tribal and non-tribal members. A traffic reminder, northbound 405 through Kirkland is shutting down this weekend. The closure between Northeast 70th Street and Northeast 124th Street starts tonight and lasts through early Monday morning while crews pave a stretch of the highway. This is KUOW News.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Progressive Insurance with its Name Your Price tool, a way to see coverage options based on a driver's budget. Learn more at progressive.com or 1-800-PROGRESSIVE. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
Welcome to Friday. Welcome to KUOW's Week in Review. I'm Bill Radke. I assemble, I gather, I invite a panel of smart, interesting, likable people to come figure out what happened this week. I did it again. I got former Washington State Attorney General Rob McKenna to come back. Welcome back, Rob.
Thank you. Glad to be back.
Let's get Rob's microphone on.
Thank you.
There you go. Or just near him. Political analyst, columnist Joni Balter. Welcome back.
Welcome back.
Thank
Good
you.
to see you all.
Thank you. Too Beautiful to Live podcast co-host Andrew Walsh.
Would you say smart, interesting, and likable? Which one am I?
You are...
Don't answer that.
Yeah. Come on, all three. Come on.
D? None of the above.
We do the show visually because we're live streaming it on YouTube. I don't have... A friend of mine asked me, how come you so often are wearing a mask for... like, do you constantly have COVID? And I often... I don't have COVID every other week. It's just that someone, and I answered her and she said, oh, you should repeat that on the air. So I'm going to. Somebody told me when I was young, very young, never walk past a water fountain and always walk past a mirror. Have you ever heard that?
No.
And I thought, oh, I'm going to try that. And to this day, I don't look in mirrors. I look I put my... I put gel. It's not that I'm not vain because I put a little gel in my hair in the morning, but then I figure therefore it's going to stay where it is. And what I look like, I just don't care what I look like. And so I often am having, and so I get on the bus and I have a COVID mask and then it never leaves me all day. So that's the answer.
Well, I have a question. How many mirrors have you broken?
Maybe that's it. Maybe it's because I'm not a good-looking person and I'm able to shatter mirrors just by walking past them.
Especially with the gel. The gel helps.
And the COVID mask. Okay, should we get to the news? That's going to be even more interesting, I guarantee. Here's a question for you. Should a federal judge in Seattle or anywhere be able to block a presidential action for the entire country? No, said the U.S. Supreme Court this morning. A Seattle judge acted after President Trump tried to rescind birthright citizenship. Birthright citizenship means if you're born here, you're automatically a citizen. When Trump tried to roll that back, Seattle judge John Kuhnauer granted a nationwide injunction that blocked Trump, not just here in Western Washington, but everywhere. And the Trump administration sued. And just a few hours ago, the Supreme Court put new limits on these nationwide injunctions from lower courts. Mr. Attorney General, former Rob McKenna, what does that decision, this morning's decision, mean for Washington State?
Well, what the court said is that if you're an individual plaintiff, you go to court, or maybe you're a group of individuals, and you're challenging an executive order and the district court judge strikes down the executive order as unconstitutional, that the effect of that is limited to the district where those plaintiffs reside. And this has been a long time coming because we've seen in the last 20, 30 years a really big increase in the use of what are called universal injunctions by district court judges. You have one judge in one district out of hundreds of districts in the country who issues a ruling in one case and says, oh, but this has national effect. President Obama complained about that. So did President Trump in his first term. So did Biden. Now you have Trump again. And it's because this has become a lot more common. And keep in mind that the district court judges don't have a constitutional power to issue rulings that have nationwide effect. They're really aggressively interpreting the power given to them by Congress. So Congress could at any time be much clearer about when they can issue injunctions with nationwide effect and when they can't, but it hasn't chosen to do so far. So there's been a lot of pressure on the Supreme Court, and an increasing number of Supreme Court justices have said, we think this has gone too far. So in this case, they're saying that a ruling involving these individuals in the Western District of Washington and a couple of other states doesn't have national effect or a universal effect, but they also remanded, which means sent back to the district courts, the related question of whether the lawsuits brought by states as the plaintiffs can have universal or national effect. And they didn't say they don't. They also didn't say they did. They said, let's have the district courts take another look at that question.
Okay, so in this case, does this mean, because Idaho, for example, did not sue over Trump's order. So does this mean unless there's a new court ruling, a baby born in Washington state will automatically be a U.S. citizen, but that's not the case if they're born across the border in Idaho?
Not necessarily because of the state lawsuits. If we were only talking about lawsuits brought by a handful of individuals and no states, then under this ruling, I would say, well, individuals in Idaho need to go to court in the district court in Idaho and seek the same relief. But because you had 22 states file lawsuits challenging this executive order,
Yep.
I think we're probably going to see a nationwide injunction or a set of injunctions upheld. Because you see, with the states have real problems here, right? What do they do with someone who is born in another state where they're not a citizen? They come to this state where they are a citizen, or vice versa. I mean, it creates tremendous problems.
Yeah.
And keep in mind, all of this is just a question of timing, right? So if you have a universal injunction, it means that the executive order is not in effect while the case works its way up through the court system, possibly all the way to the Supreme Court. If you don't have an injunction, same thing. I mean, okay, so the executive order is in effect while the case works its way up.
Yeah.
But it's really just a question of timing. Universal injunctions are what we're talking about here are temporary or preliminary injunctions. They're not permanent.
Okay. So it's a matter of time, and nobody thinks the birthright citizenship that Trump's order is going to be upheld.
No. He lost with Republican and Democratic judges. He's lost on this question because the language of the Constitution is really clear on this, and there's no reasonable way to reinterpret it. And so it'll be interesting to see. I'm betting there'll be at least a couple of Supreme Court justices who will decide that subject to the jurisdiction of that clause in the amendment of the Constitution.
That's what Trump is banking on.
Yeah. They may go along with that, but I think even that should be unlikely because they're textualists, which means they're looking at what the writers of that language meant when they wrote it in the 1800s. And when they wrote it, it's clear they meant if you're the child of a diplomat or at that time, if you're a Native American, you're not subject to the jurisdiction of. But they were really trying to make sure that the southern states could not strip away rights for emancipated, formerly enslaved people.
Right. Anything else to...
Well, this may be mostly about timing, but it has the feel of a couple of things. That the court is leaning toward broader powers for the executive and, in effect, more limited powers for the other branches of government. That's how it kind of feels and sounds. And the thing I really don't like about it is it enables a presidential strategy of break the law now and figure it out later. And sort of like just buying time for these policies that you think are so important or dazzling or however that goes.
Rob had me feeling so much better, Joni. Why are you doing this?
I like that.
I was starting to feel good again.
But remember, Joni, that means that you could apply that to what Obama did. He was breaking the law, and we couldn't. And he had a bunch of his stuff enjoined.
Bipartisan, and they all judge shop, and I get that.
So.
Many of the Democratic state attorney generals file their challenges to the Trump administration for some reason in Rhode Island. They
It's
know
a small
that
state. Traffic is easier. Parking is easy.
It's the parking. It's the parking. I knew it. Yeah.
Hey, before we take a break, since we're on court rulings, I want to ask you about the President Trump's Justice Department trying to block this new Washington state law. We have a law now that requires clergy to report evidence of child sexual abuse, even if that clergy is, let's say, a Catholic priest who the church forbids from revealing what was said to him during confession. From the Seattle Catholic Archdiocese, Bishop Frank Schuster testified against the bill, saying this could force priests to violate their religious vows and lead to excommunication.
The seal of confession is essential to the rite because a penitent has the right to confess their sins without worrying their sins will become public.
Victim advocate Mary Dispenza testified that this law would have helped abuse survivors like her if priests had been forced to report their suspicions.
I carried the weight and secrecy until I was 52. Soon I will be 85, and I do not understand why any religion would want the freedom to keep child abuse secret.
Governor Ferguson listened and signed this bill into law, saying priests should have to report abuse like everybody else.
A variety of other professions that frequently interact with children, including police officers, nurses, and school personnel, are required to report incidents of suspected abuse.
But Governor, teachers don't take a sacred vow of confidentiality. Surely you're aware of that, being a Catholic yourself.
Well, I'm aware of my upbringing as Catholic and having an uncle who's a Jesuit. For me, this is very clear, very clear legislation and important legislation.
If only we had someone on this panel with both legal training and the surname McKenna. Rob, the Trump Justice Department says this Washington law explicitly targets religious practices such as the sacrament of confession in the Catholic Church, and they say the law is, quote, anti-Catholic. Do you agree?
I don't think it's anti-Catholic in particular. I think it is. I think it fails to respect the priest-penitent privilege, the confidentiality privilege. I don't understand why they didn't exempt knowledge gained in the confessional from this requirement. After all, priests pick up information, and so do other clergy, rabbis and the like, in all kinds of ways. And that's not covered by the confessional privilege, right, Joni?
And you know that they had a version of the bill that did carve out the confessions, and that's probably where this is going to end up.
Specifically for the Catholic Church, right?
Or
was that?
The privilege applies to any religion where it's established as a privilege, right? So I think a court could narrow this down by carving out what they learn in the confession. I mean, Joni, you made the point when we were preparing. Our priests have lots of ways they can get this information out without violating the confessional.
If you talk to a priest or two, I may have done that. Most priests are 100% on board with reporting child abuse. Gleaned, discovered, whatever the right word is there, in every other way than confession.
Right.
And then I'll add this. It comes up very infrequently. You'll find that child abuse persons, people who commit, are often in denial, I'm told. And if they're in denial, it's not going to come up in confession anyway. So it's a very rare thing. And it's sort of like, it just reminds me in some ways of, how President Trump framing this as anti-Catholic in the same way that he says that he saves Christmas from the Democrats. It's just an example.
Okay, but that's true. Thank God for making
I thought you were a lapsed Republican.
Is that why we put Trump on the top of our Christmas tree this year? Can I ask you guys a question? I'm going to betray my ignorance here, but I did some really quick Googling, and I don't know if I trust myself, but what about carve-outs for actual, like, therapists, psychologists? Like, do they have mandatory reporting as well, right? Is it specifically just because this is a religious ritual?
I don't understand. I mean,
Good
lawyers are violate their ethical code if they violate the privilege by telling they are allowed to go and report about someone who's said they're going to commit a crime in the future.
That's a lawyer.
Yeah,
I'm
saying
a
we
therapist,
but
like
we represent. I'm just saying there are privileges that apply.
Yeah.
And I'm not an expert on the therapist privilege.
Well, I mean, again, it was a very quick Google, and I definitely didn't go to law school, so I don't want to. I don't want to say anything.
Wait, was it AI representing it? Because they're wrong about.
I promise you, I didn't just read the
time.
AI overview, but it was my understanding that even in because I grew up in the Catholic Church, and I understand the sacredness of the confession. In the confessional, if you're a believer, but I'm no longer a believer, so I don't see a huge difference between going in and either, I don't know if you want to say confessing or admitting or discussing with a licensed therapist, psychologist, psychiatrist. I believe they have to report if it's something specific to child endangerment. And so there, for me as an atheist now, I think, but that's so you get a carve out just because you believe in something I don't believe in. That's a very cynical way of putting it. I don't mean to insult people who do have faith, but for me who doesn't, it sort of seems like, that seems like a strange carve-out.
If this goes up to this Supreme Court, they have been moving very strongly in the direction of the free exercise clause of the First Amendment. There's also the Establishment Clause, which isn't implicated here, but the free exercise clause to defend the rights of religious people to practice their religions. They just issued another decision today that involves that very question in favor of
in school
and parents being able to pull their kids out when they believe the curriculum violates their religious. So
what
it's a very
about
strong free exercise court.
And there's a lot of Catholics on the court, I guess. But what about there are Rastafarians who challenge laws against growing and using marijuana? Is there any difference?
There's actually case law on this. There was a famous case involving the sacrifice of chickens, as I recall. It might have been a Rastafarian case. So they do look at the edges. The use of peyote, if I'm pronouncing that right. Peyote,
but why is that an edge? What makes it an edge? Why isn't anyone's religion? Why, if I have a religion, I remember reading actually a long time ago. Somebody, I don't remember the religion, but they refused to have a name, to have a legal name, because they said their religion teaches that their identity is not separate from anyone else. Whatever that's their religion, right? And they didn't want to. They were being asked or forced to identify themselves. So my point is, whatever. I can call anything I want a religion, but why is religion a? It goes to the Constitution. It says it prohibits you can't prohibit or interfere with the free exercise.
Right.
But anything could come up against the law, and why should, to Andrew's point, why should a religious person's desire to do something, even if it breaks the law, why should we recognize
because the Constitution protects our individual exercise of our religious
So
beliefs.
what about Rastafarians and peyote? And
I mean,
you're doing pretty big slippery slope. Isn't this a very specific case?
But why carve out why carve out a religion? Are you saying it's because it's a very popular religion, or what?
Well, that's where the administration's coming from.
But there are a lot of cases where people's rights to use certain drugs and perform certain rituals are upheld precisely because they fall within the religious ambit. So, that's been recognized again and again. And look, we have judges in order to draw lines, right? We ask them to draw lines and make distinctions. And I think in this case involving this law, the courts are going to come in if the legislature doesn't do it, and they're going to say making them mandatory reporters outside of the confessional is okay, but you can't require them to violate the priest penitent privilege, the confidentiality.
Because you end up in some ways perhaps destroying the value of the confession. People are going to say, I can't go in there and tell them some other thing because I don't trust them now that they participate.
But again, would that apply to a therapist as well? Isn't it good for people to be able to have that kind of safe space in a secular place as well? Why? What is special here? Why is it more important to say something like this to a priest than to a healthcare provider?
Well, it is in the Constitution whether we like it or not.
Yeah,
I guess
no,
is,
that's
is
the
another
thing.
question.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so if Joni, were you saying a priest, maybe you were saying that a priest could get this information another way? So the idea is that a priest
and are eager to to act on that in every other way.
So
yes.
is a priest told, look, if a confessor says something like that, see if you can get him to repeat it outside of the confessional? Is that?
I don't think
how
it's
else they
that
would get it?
specific. I think it would, rightly put a priest in a position of for the, especially the history of the Catholic Church, to try to figure it out some other way or not. That priest might say, I am so into the sort of preciousness, value of confession that I won't do that. Because they're not allowed to violate that at the moment.
And to answer Andrew's question,
sorry.
your question about therapists, I mean, we've made a decision as a matter of public policy that the privilege between doctors and patients, therapists and patients, can be overridden by a policy concern about abused children.
Yeah.
And the doctor-patient relationship is not enshrined in the Constitution.
Right. Well, right. I mean,
Right,
that's
so
the answer, but I guess I just don't like it.
But we limit
when you're
free speech is in the Constitution, and we limit it.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I guess, I'm showing my bias here. One thing I did want to say, sort of on behalf of the churches, like you said, Joni, like it's going to be probably a pretty rare case where somebody does actually confess this in the confessional. And from what I know, growing up, going to confession is, chances are the priest is going to say, a big part of confession is the penance, right? Like
Right. That's what
and it could be saying a certain number of prayers. It could be treating your sister better if your sin was against her or whatever. So the priest could say, well, your penance is you must turn yourself in, right?
Yeah,
like
possibly.
that is potentially something that they could do in their
that's
defense. I
interesting.
mean, that is, and I would hope that a priest would encourage somebody to do that. But generally speaking, I just kind of, as somebody who does, and I know it's enshrined in the same way other things are enshrined that I might not necessarily agree with in our laws. It seems kind of goofy to me if we feel like the most important thing is to protect children from gross, terrible abuses. And without pulling pot shots here, with the history of the Catholic Church and then, like, for a decade being the face of abuse of children, I would just think as an institution you would be first in line to say, yes, we are going to report it. This is the most important thing in the world, is protecting children. It's so hard to disagree with.
Yeah, if we're going to take into account the hallowed history of such a cherished institution, some histories of institutions aren't so good.
Yeah.
Okay, did we cover it?
It's doctrinal. I mean, they're not going to make an exception to the privilege, the confidentiality in the confessional. They can't. I mean, then it really does open the door. Like, what else are we going to make us?
Well, you could be excommunicated and go on with go on with your life.
Right.
It's not
If you
the death
violate
penalty.
Well, I mean,
That's
you
exactly
could
right.
choose to do it. That's right. But of course, but making it the rule, especially if it's that as rare as you're saying it is, Andrew, and I think you're right. You and Joni both
Yeah,
are right.
kinda like
How
grasping
much
up
is
with
it really
Joni.
improving the protection of children if it's rare in the first instance?
That's
but
the point.
but creating the precedent that you're trying by statute to break it, it's not going to hold up in the court.
Yeah, legally, and again, like that's why I mean nobody's asking me to represent them in the courts. Obviously, I'm just a big mushy ball of feelings over here. But like, I would rather a constitution enshrine the protection of children over the protection of religion. That's just where I'm coming from.
Well, there are about half a dozen states that have a law like Washington. Washington's not the first. There are laws that don't carve out exceptions for the Catholic Church. And by the way, it's not just the Catholic Church. In Arizona, a Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints member allegedly told 2 bishops and several other church officials that he was sexually abusing his daughter. The church excommunicated the man, but never told civil authorities about the confession, and a judge dismissed a child sexual abuse lawsuit on the basis of the state's clergy penitent privilege, and that is being appealed. So this is an open, live question, and the Washington State Republican Party is supporting the Trump DOJ lawsuit. The Attorney General, Nick Brown's office, said it's reviewing the DOJ complaint and will respond in court. We will follow it for you. Let's take a break and get back with more news of the week on KUOW's Week in Review.
Support for KUOW comes from Third Place Books, presenting Jeopardy host Ken Jennings on Thursday, July 31st at 7 p.m. Tickets and more information is available at thirdplacebooks.com.
AI, self-driving cars, violent heat domes, and the all-too-occasional glimmer of hope. Is it just me, or is science fiction getting a little too real these days? I'm Katie Campbell, and on the latest episode of Meet Me Here, we're predicting what to expect at Clarion West's Speculative Fiction Write-a-thon this summer. What kind of future could you imagine? Listen to Meet Me Here on the KUOW app or wherever you get your podcasts.
It's KUOW's Week in Review. I'm Bill Radke here with former Attorney General Rob McKenna and Too Beautiful to Live's Andrew Walsh and political analyst Joni Balter. If New York City might have a socialist mayor, why not Seattle? This week, a 33-year-old New York State Assemblyman named Zohran Mamdani won that city's Democratic mayoral primary. And party leaders do not know how to feel about this. Is this guy Mamdani a model for how you re-energize young progressive voters, which Democrats so want to do? Maybe, but will moderate American voters say, look how lefty the Democrats have gotten? They're electing a fill in the blank, Muslim immigrant raving socialist.
I'll make buses fast and free. I'll make childcare available to all New Yorkers at no cost. And I'll freeze the rent for every single rent-stabilized tenant. We can do all of that and so much more. Because this is New York. We can afford to dream.
How dare you? Seattle had a Democratic Socialist city councilor, Shama Sawant, and her critics often said she was too far left, even for us, even for Seattle. But does Mamdani's success so far tell Seattle Democrats that they could win by being more progressive, not less?
So I will say, first of all, hats off to Zohran Mamdani, 33 years old. Originally polling at 1%, and now he knocked off a dynasty. Probably knocked off a dynasty. The election there was all about affordability, economics, populist anger. It's a huge issue across the country, even in places like Spokane and most surely Seattle. My larger point here is, however, never underestimate the power of the Democratic Party to seize onto what is probably a short-term theme, only to have it smack them upside their head. That's Pittsburgh talk, I'm sorry. A short time later as a costly political mistake. I offer you defund the police. That was a hot idea. Open borders. So this is
But he just won a primary.
I understand. A lot of different factors there than here. And this is a time when Democrats are supposed to be figuring out how to talk to the political middle. How do you know? Republicans love this. Their quotes are all about, so the party's anti-police, Zionist, the whole bit. So I don't think it's a smart move. I'd be careful before I adopt it.
Okay, in this argument, you're agreeing with the happy Republicans. Andrew?
I'm just curious, what move do you mean? What is not a smart move? If the Democratic Party decides that they're going to rally around this branch of the party? Because I don't know if
exactly.
Are people saying
no,
that?
Yes,
or are
exactly. They're trying to figure out how to talk to, I thought they were, they should be, how to
this
talk
is one
to middle.
city. There's lots of other elections where they're electing moderate candidates.
Well, first of all, the last election right here in Seattle was very clear. The very progressive agenda was not favored.
Yeah.
Bruce Harrell won. He won, and he came in with a moderate, we use these terms here, but I guess I'll buy that one, not conservative, but a moderate agenda. City Council changed dramatically toward the center. The voters here are not going to, in my view, give that all up right now. So because of what happened in New York.
Andrew, did I interrupt you?
No, not at all. I'm interested in this. And again, I want to make it clear in the same way, I'm not a lawyer. I'm certain nobody's hiring me to be a political consultant either. I'm just, a voter who follows these things. I'm a pretty progressive-minded voter at that. I don't worry too much about the Democratic Party on a national level rallying around this particular far-left example. I also think actually
Why not? Because the Republicans in subsequent elections, Sorry?
Because the Democrats are totally spineless.
Well, that's true.
I just did not see a lot of. Here's the deal, and I feel like I kind of tried to explain my feelings on this the last time I was on, and I crashed and burned. So let's do it again.
You won't. I'm with you this time. I'm going to support you.
Go for it.
No. And I'm not trying to win any points. It's just trying to sort out my own feelings on these things. Like when I look at the campaign that Kamala Harris ran, and obviously that's a different kind of campaign. That's a national presidential campaign. But when you look at that, I feel like the Republicans really did pull this magic trick where they were sort of like they're like these bullies that are convincing us that we're just hitting ourselves while they grab our wrists and punch us in the face. Like the Democratic platform on the national level for the last presidential election was not that progressive. It was a law enforcement person who was making all kinds of concessions to reach across the aisle, to make promises to put Republicans on her cabinet. Like there was so much of that. But that's not the takeaway. That's not the lesson anybody is going to remember from that. They're going to remember that the Democrats really hurt themselves because they were too progressive. And I don't think that's true. I think that's everybody believing the kind of MAGA talking points.
Rob, any opinions?
In terms of the impact or reverberations of Mondani's election on our area, I think it should encourage people who lean Democratic Socialist that there's a set of messages out there that may appeal to people who are really tired of really high housing prices, for example.
Yeah.
And it was interesting that apparently one of the groups that he pulled over to his camp that allowed him to win, at least the primary, were college-educated younger voters who are, in New York are really having a hard time getting by because housing is so expensive. And
the complaints are legitimate.
Yeah, well, they are. And as a conservative, I would ask them to ask themselves, why is housing so expensive? What is the same party's been running this town for decades? So you're now going to double down on that and put someone in it. So anyway, that's another matter. But here in this area,
but he wants to freeze rent on rent stabilized.
Oh, that's going to do a lot to increase housing
City-sponsored
supply.
grocery stores.
How much can he actually do that he promises?
This is the key because New York is as a city is highly dependent on the state. So I don't know that he can make buses free without the state agreeing to it.
Okay.
The state in New York controls a lot of the revenues that the city depends on. So I actually think he's going to find it a lot harder to get this stuff done. But hey, it's a campaign.
Yeah,
it's
right.
all about aspiration. So we'll worry about the details later.
Well, can I draft off of that for a second? Because that's the other thing too. Is this a national model, or is this guy just really likable? He's like a really likable person.
One-time moment in politics that you want to be careful. Here's the quote. The new face of the Democratic Party is an anti-ICE, anti-police, anti-Semitic socialist. And that's coming from
Where's that coming from?
That's from his campaign website.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
It wasn't from
I've been hacked.
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry. What was that quote from? That's
the head of the National Republican.
Yeah. Okay. So
sounds like the
again,
National Republican
right?
Party.
And so I guess again, like, how much are they going to let that sort of set the talking points for the Democratic Party? And that's where I would sort of wish, as somebody who votes Democratic, would wish that the party would stop taking their cues from the opposition. And again, like I know I'm not in step with the average American voter, but I'm just going to be like
Are
true
you
to
in
myself.
step with the average Seattle voter? That would be the question.
Probably, like the voters like me who live in the city, I feel like it. But even amongst us, and like, not to make this like super personal here, but like I used to be much more conservative, and I used to joke around that my partner I've been with for 25 years kind of radicalized me. But now ever since the November election, we have we're fine. I don't want anybody to be nervous. We're doing great.
Go fund me right now.
We have
I'll do
real
it.
heated debates about what happened in November and what the future of the party is. And I'm now like very left of her. Like more than ever, I feel like, kind of as I just said before, I feel like the bullies sort of won, and not even a good representation of what the Republican Party is and should be. And I think we would all agree on that. I don't want to speak
Also
for you,
elapsed-
Rob, but
yeah.
I mean, and so and yet I sort of feel like what's happening is, like, we're letting the bullies sort of bully us, and then our reaction is, well, I guess we did sort of deserve it. And I'm like, no, more than ever. The only thing I believe in anymore is standing up for what I believe in. And if I'm not in step with most of America, so be it. I will continue to be loud for the things I believe in, the progressive causes I believe in, for the people, for the most vulnerable. And if that means I'm not in step with the Democratic Party, then I'm not a Democrat. That's fine. I'm just always going to vote for the best option from now on. And I'm not thinking strategically. I'm just thinking about what's important to me.
Yeah. Joni, one of the things that this Democratic socialist had the gall to campaign on is a social housing development agency. Seattle voters
went for it
in
Yeah.
huge numbers. So I know you're convinced by this this mayoral election and the city council election. Maybe you're convinced that things never change. They don't swing back and forth, and that Seattle.
Well, things absolutely swing back and forth. Of course they do. But that measure, you put it on the ballot. It's not in a general or primary election, and you offer up something that sounds very good for you, and it does, and it wins. But we do that in a vacuum, not especially if you're doing it in non-regular elections. The Februarys, the Aprils, and things like that. You're saying that.
I thought they put it in a low interest election
Right.
and lost anyway. The city council didn't want to back that social housing, and it won anyway.
And it won anyway because it sounds good. Seattle voters are notorious, may I say notorious, for voting for all the sort of good public uses, transportation, schools, school support from the city. And
Okay,
that's
so
why
you're
we
saying
have,
if a Seattle mayor came out and campaigned on, let's say, rent freeze, more restrictions on landlords, universal child care, higher corporate taxes, free buses, gender-affirming health care, sanctuary city, city-owned grocery stores, triple the available affordable housing units, $30 hour minimum wage, social housing development agency. Again, that's separate from whether these are good ideas, but I'm just not as sure that was the platform of the guy who just shocked the country and won the Democratic mayoral primary. And maybe it wouldn't fly in Seattle. I'm just not as sure as you are.
well, neither is anyone as sure as that. Because think about it, Seattle is also notoriously tough on mayors for the last 15 years. One-term mayor Mike McGinn, Ed Murray, much of one term, Jenny Durkin, one term, Bruce Harrell, let's be fair, afraid of becoming one term, right? So he's listening to some of it.
Let's talk about that. Bruce Harrell, just some would say, tacked to the left because he has he's endorsed this idea of raising taxes on the city's wealthiest companies and cutting taxes for almost all the smaller businesses. This is a new business and occupation tax levy. It would go to the voters, and it would raise about $90 million for housing assistance, homelessness services, food assistance, and small business support. And the mayor called the plan business friendly. So does Seattle now have a lefty mayor, Joni?
No, not because of this. It is a tack to the left. In some ways, I thought this was a genius move because the mayor gets credit for working with probably the most progressive council member, Alex Mercedes Rink, and so he gets credit for what amounts to crossing the political aisle in Seattle politics, working on a project that is, a move left, but that may not even come to fruition because of the timing of placing this on the ballot in November.
Right.
You have to have it all done, I think, by August 5th. And if this measure went on the ballot, it would pass. Pretty sure everybody agrees with that. So it's a popular move. It's very good for small businesses, which is one of the most sort of popular causes. Keeping them alive is one of the most popular causes you could have in Seattle. So that's why I thought this is pretty wise either way for him to do.
Okay.
I always get warm and fuzzy and again, I know they're all Democrats, and here we are in Washington having our little, talking about the divide, right? And so I understand there's some, privilege there from this perspective. But, I do think it's a smart move. I'm not personally a huge fan of Harold, and he's not somebody that I plan on voting for in his reelection. But I do look at this, and I get the warm and fuzzies when I say, okay, well, I'm more aligned with Alexis Mercedes Rink, and, knowing that they're finding a way to say, well, listen, we're we're going to have a shortfall. These are real issues, but can we find something that seems appealing to folks, And like, I always kind of, I do legitimately appreciate that. And when even, President Sarah Nelson, Council President Sarah Nelson, like, I appreciate that not everything is completely in lockstep. I remember, I think it was a month ago, the being able to rezone some areas in Soto for housing was very controversial. And I'm suddenly like, oh, okay, I guess I'm on Nelson's side here. Like, I always kind of like it when the politics surprise me a little bit and people are looking for ways.
You have religious and political flex, from what I'm hearing.
I don't know if I'm trying to flex or if I have flexibility. But anyway, yeah, so that's just sort of my gut reaction on it.
Okay. Rob, are you going to speak up against taxing the golden goose of big companies? And by the way, it's not even profits; it's just revenues.
Yeah, it's gross revenues. This is the issue with the B&O tax: is that you could be losing money hand over fist as you get your business off the ground, or even later in time, and you're still paying the tax. But
because you have a lot of revenue.
Yeah, exactly. So Seattle passed this payroll excise tax some years ago to try to hit companies that pay people, was it $150,000 or more, whatever the threshold is. Yeah. And so guess what? That hasn't produced anywhere near the revenue they predicted, because Amazon has moved, I think, 25,000 to Bellevue. And so this is really dangerous, because they're going to put the B&O tax burden for Seattle on about, what did they say in the article, 2,300 businesses? These businesses can move, and many of them will move, and many of them already have moved, or several notable businesses have already moved because of the payroll excise tax. And this B&O tax proposal threatens to have the same effect. I mean, first, let me be clear, I'm really sympathetic to small businesses. My wife owns a small business. We lived in Seattle. She paid plenty of B&O tax to the city of Seattle. But putting all the burden on a relatively small number of companies is really problematic, just practically speaking, putting aside whether you think it's a good idea or not, as a policy matter.
Okay. I have to give Rob McKenna the last word, because it is time to take a break and come back and hit some more of the big stories this week in this region on Week in Review, and we come right back.
Support for KUOW comes from Seattle Chamber Music Society. Kenji Lopez-Alt and James Ennis host Tasting Notes, an event pairing live music with culinary craft, featuring chefs Renee Erickson, Lee Kindell, Kevin Smith, and more. July 25th at Benaroya Hall. Tickets and info at seattlechambermusic.org.
Your commute home just got a whole lot more local with me, Kim Malcolm, and KUOW's new All Things Considered podcast. Catch up on the local and national news of the day, available in your podcast feed every weekday afternoon. That's 1 hour of original programming and analysis you can listen to while also thinking about what's for dinner. Listen on the KUOW app or search KUOW All Things Considered wherever you get podcasts.
You're listening to KUOW's Week in Review, and I compliment you for that. I'm Bill Radke. We are with Too Beautiful to Live co-host Andrew Walsh, political analyst Joni Balter, and former Washington Attorney General Rob McKenna. Dozens of 8-foot-tall interactive digital kiosks are coming to Seattle's business districts within the next year. City Council gave it the green light this week. The bill's sponsor, the aforementioned Sarah Nelson, says with the city about to host the World Cup, these kiosks are paramount. She said paramount to making Seattle accessible and welcoming to these 750,000 soccer fans.
And so these will be visible resources on city blocks that will help people to locate interesting places to go, and also public transit that's live and in many different languages.
You can get free Wi-Fi there and info about emergency services. Andrew, you said you're troubled. You're out of step with your cohort.
Yeah, I told you before the show that I feel like most people that I sort of align with, I don't know, politically, culturally, that kind of stuff, have been raising some concerns about this, from walkability, pedestrian rights, some privacy concerns we can get into later.
Commercialism.
And just general commercialism, which, I don't know what you're going to do about that. But when I was a kid, I saw a film called Back to the Future Part 2. And in it, a young man is thrust into the future. Are you guys familiar? Marty McFly, and he's walking down the street, and he walks by a modern, or like a futuristic marquee for a movie, and they're showing Jaws, and the huge hologram of Jaws jumps off of the marquee and almost like snaps his head off, and it scares him for a moment. This isn't that.
Oh.
But if it gets us one step
thought that was the
closer to
sales
that,
pitch.
that is the sales pitch. If this gets us closer to that reality that I've been looking at since 1986
You
or
love it.
1989, we have to see how it plays out. We simply must.
Okay.
That's
you
my
don't
my
mind-
hot take.
You don't mind that's the hot
I
take?
want to see what they look like in all seriousness. Like I know, I mean, I'm not some huge fan of commercialism, but I mean, come on, toothpaste is out of the tube on that. I just feel like a lot of the concerns people are raising, and they just sort of seem like, well, it could be this, or down the line, it could be a lot of slippery slope stuff. And I'm like, well, let's just see. What is the, it is kind of a long contract, right? It's like a 30-year contract that's split into two 15-year segments or something like that with an option to renew. So it is kind of a long time commitment, but I just don't see it bringing that many problems to the city streets.
Speaking of Back to the Future,
okay,
how's that for a segue?
Yeah,
I was on
beautiful.
the county council in the early 2000s. There was a serious consideration given to put up what's called street furniture. So kiosks with advertising on them, more advertising in bus shelters. It's what the company J.C. Decaux, which is the big promoter of this idea, at least at the time it was, calls an improvement for the street landscape so that you share the advertising revenue with the city, right? And it didn't end up going anywhere. I don't recall exactly why, just that people weren't that excited about it. And by the way, they were going to put in the public toilets too with advertising on them and support.
We used to be more anti-commercial back then.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think maybe these kiosks are more value added in terms of the fact they're interactive. And you go to airports now. They're all over the place. You can navigate the airport, find where the restaurants are, and so forth. So I think people are more used to them. They see the value of them now, and they are in a lot more cities that have them. And I just don't think people don't think it's that big a deal. I think they think it's probably okay.
Joni, are you going to bring the outrage?
No, I'm for these, at least for the trial, the first 30. And the reason is a couple reasons. I would love to see, the information. A street is closed. A highway exit is open or closed. Here's directions to, some public event, emergency calls and all that.
That's
advertising
not on your cell
artists. Well, that's the point. You're getting there. That many people walking have their heads down. Now, if they bump into one of these kiosks, that'll be different. But it'd be great to get those eyes from down while they're walking through intersections on sidewalks and look at that thing. It'll keep you straight on the straight and narrow. And I think that's why I'm open to them, at least for the first 30 in downtown. And I absolutely think the surveillance argument that these guys are, going to catch you at something is ridiculous, because anytime you're on a public street, everyone does have a phone and they are filming things you don't have any idea that they're filming. So if you want to hide something, I'm thinking, a mask, as you mentioned, that you wear in public.
That's why you wear the mask.
Or paint on a mustache, something. If you got something to hide, there are other ways.
And they don't even have these surveillance
and
cameras
the contract
on them
says,
at this point. But
Right.
the concern is, well, that's just a big thing that could have a surveillance camera on it.
I think the contract says you cannot use it that way.
Right.
I'm looking forward to the version of these kiosks we saw in Minority Report, because you've got me thinking about movies, right? Tom Cruise and the ad speaks to you. Like, Joni, hey, we've got a special on your favorite perfume today.
That's actually a better example.
Well, that would kind of make me jump.
That's a better
couple
example
feet.
than my shark one. I don't know how you pull that
That would
up.
make me jump a couple of feet. I think if they say your name, that's don't do that.
I think
Don't
we're a
do that.
long way away from that ever.
Yeah.
It'll never happen. But this is an opening the door to a new level of technology. That much is true.
And you mentioned before the show too that I couldn't agree with you more, Rob, that there's just not an expectation of privacy anymore. When you're walking down the street in these heavily trafficked areas where these things are going to appear, do I ever think for one moment that there are not eyes on me, and the digital eyes on me?
Well, CCTV cameras.
You agree? Okay.
Security.
Joni, they all agree with you. With what
This
you
hasn't
said.
happened
Which
for
turned
this
out,
show.
which
but
turned
we
out to
can
be
keep
really
doing it.
important in the United Healthcare CEO murder, right? They tracked that guy. It was an unbelievable
How much footage?
how much video they had.
How
of that
much
kid.
footage?
Oh, is that a pro-surveillance, put cameras on these kiosks argument?
No, not for these kiosks, but I'm just saying it's the way the world works now.
It's the way the world works.
Okay, so here, speaking of topics on which maybe people will agree with Joni, a plan, because
that is the goal.
I know how you
thought.
feel. There was a plan to sell about 3,000 square miles of federal lands in western states it got ruled out because it was in the Republicans' tax and spending cut bill, the big, gorgeous bill. But the Senate parliamentarian keeps whacking stuff out and saying that doesn't meet the procedural rules. It doesn't fit in this bill. So the sponsor, who's from Utah, wanted to sell public lands in the West to states or to other entities, saying, well, it could be used for housing. Don't we need more housing or infrastructure? But as I say, the parliamentarian said no, and so did a bunch of hikers and hunters and fishers. And Joni, you're glad to see this being
glad to see
revised
it jettisoned.
downward.
It's a stupid idea.
Adjusted anyway, adjusted
It's a
downward.
stupid idea. You know, hunters, fisher people, if that's the right phrase, outdoors people, they're all going to complain. And there was a carve-out, speaking of carve-outs, for Montana.
Yeah.
Which was like, this is not legitimate legislation by any stretch if you're going to carve out a state. 5 House Republicans, including our own Eastern Washington Representative Dan Newhouse, they're against it. And it's because the people who live in these areas, like Eastern Washington, they like their public lands and they don't want to mess with.
Yeah. So it's going to be the sponsor in Utah says, okay, not U.S. Forest Service land, but still Bureau of Land Management land that's close enough to where people are that we could put more housing there.
I think it's legitimate to look at federal lands as like let's think about old military reservations that are no longer used. I mean, California's done some great things with the old Fort Ord property by Monterey, for example, with the Presidio in San Francisco, and we do need more land for housing. I mean, I think the housing shortage and housing costs are the biggest social and economic challenge facing us today. It's a huge problem. So I think it's good to be creative, but Americans love their parklands and they love their forest lands, and I think the idea of selling those lands is a non-starter.
Andrew, anything to add?
Yeah, like I said, you'll be shocked to hear that I'm not for selling off public lands. Not exactly in my value set.
Well, my family likes to drive to a guest ranch in the Canadian Rockies and learn to ride horses in the woods. Am I giving my kids an appreciation of nature, or am I ruining nature when I do that? It's a private. I guess you call it a resort, guest ranch. It's a private resort. Is that making the world worse? A worse place?
Because it's private property.
Yeah,
you're
it's
saying.
private property.
Oh well, I mean, I'm not saying abolish all private property.
Your words, sir. Your words.
He said he's really progressive these days.
Abolish private property. You know what? I am going to run for city council. No, but I mean, I do think. I mean, Rob, you make a really good point. Like, I am not super well informed on this. I don't know if that was your point, but it was a good one. But like the idea that we picture all public land as being like pristine rivers and natures. No, there might be things that have already been used for some sort of military or industrial purposes. Like, yeah, if we can make that into housing, that's all good. But I think the problem here is it's just like a lot of things coming out of that bill. This is kind of disingenuous, I think, right? Like, and it's non-starter.
It reminded me of a book I read about Theodore Roosevelt and the history of public lands and Gifford Pinchot. In fact, your husband wrote a really good book that touched on some of these same topics. The Big Burn, one of my favorite books that Tim wrote.
Very nice, thanks.
Really, really good. But there was a lot of pushback from conservatives in those days who didn't want to lock up the lands. But what struck Roosevelt was taking a train ride from northern New York and seeing mile after mile after mile of clear cut with nothing happening to it. So, there's been a push and pull, and the fact is, the federal government owns huge amounts of land in states like Nevada, Utah, and elsewhere. So that's where I think this tension comes from. It's not an accident that Mike Lee of Utah is pushing this.
We got to go, which means I got to ask you what made you smile this week. I'll start you with this, and I have to take you back about 20 years. The billionaire owners of the Supersonics told the people of Seattle to cough up more money for a new stadium or else. So Seattleites convened a town hall, and they said, you know what? If we don't spend that stadium money, we could use that to help vulnerable people. And besides, we've had this team for 60 years. We've won an NBA championship. Let's gift the team to another city, and not a rich coastal city, but someone who's never experienced the joys of pro sports. We want them to enjoy that special feeling. Don't we tell our kids to share? And that is how Seattle decided to generously give away the Supersonics. And this week, Mayor Bruce Harrell held a news conference to congratulate our cousins to the southeast. Let's listen to Mayor Harrell.
Let's meet your 2025 NBA champion, Oklahoma City
The Thunder won it all, and I don't think every city would be as gracious as we have been about this. A lot of Americans have a zero-sum, that's mine, you can't have it attitude. But in Seattle, we see beyond tribalism and selfishness, and that makes me smile, Seattle. You reminded me this week why I love you. Anybody else smiling as much as I am?
That was the most extended sarcasm riff
Thank
I've
you.
ever
I know,
heard.
and I'm afraid people weren't certain that it was continuing to be sarcasm.
Wow, that was good, Bill.
Well, I was smiling.
I share your bitterness, by the way. I deeply felt.
Oh, thank you. We got to go. Who else smiled?
I smiled at the sort of fabulous tension between Venice and our former Seattleite. I'm trying to stay local here. Jeff Bezos.
Yeah.
I don't know how in the world he thought he was going to, shall we say, rent Venice and have a very kind of private, personal wedding, because Venice is full of tourists, overcrowded, and there's a sort of growing anti-tourist in general, oligarchs plus sentiment. So that was, I don't know, it just made me laugh.
Love it. Anybody else? Quick smile.
I took 4 escalators to get here today using public transportation, and on every single escalator, I was so pleased to see that everybody stayed to the right-hand side and let faster walkers go up and down on the left. I couldn't believe it. The city is not super great at spatial awareness, and I was like, we're learning.
If you could just translate that to the freeways, we'd really
thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Rob, anything to
Pike
add?
Place Market, we've been down there the last couple of Sundays, and Amy and I are so impressed by all the improvements that have been made. And, the latest one that we noticed is Victor Steinbrook Park. It's been renovated. It was full of families, children enjoying the view. It was just so great. That whole area is just fabulous.
Oh, now you made me genuinely happy. Former State Attorney General Rob McKenna did that. Seattle political analyst and contributing columnist
see how that
Joni
happened.
Balter.
I really can't.
And the co-host of the Too Beautiful to Live podcast, Andrew Walsh. Thank you all for being a great show.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Producer Kevin Kniestedt, Kathy Faulkner on the board, social media from Juan Pablo Chiquiza and Hans Twite, and I'm Bill Radke, and I'll see you in a week for Week in Review.
This is KUOW-FM Seattle, KUOW Tumwater, KQOW Bellingham.
From the BBC World Service, I'm Rebecca Kesby. Today, a month into the new and controversial method of delivering food aid in Gaza, we interview the chair of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, who says reports of deaths at aid sites is disinformation